Now let's talk about outdoor composting methods. Composting pile, trench composting, and a tumble composting. A compost pile is a heap of manure or vegetation and other organic residues that are decaying that become compost. The process is to start with a 4 to 6 layer of twigs at the bottom of the compost pile. Layer nitrogen rich greens and carbon rich brands about 4 to 6 inches thick. Water as you go, the pile should remain damp. As materials break down, the pile will get hot. Use a pitchfork or a shovel to turn the pile and repeat. Harvest. Harvest when compostable materials are unrecognizable and the compost is fresh smelling, dark, and crumbly. Harvest with a shovel. Use harvested compost in the yard, flower beds, gardens, or potted plants to fertilize. Tools needed for pile composting: a DIY or purchased bin. DIY plans are linked. The size recommendation is 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot to retain heat and moisture while remaining easy to turn. The location should be convenient to add compostable material, shady, and has good drainage. The pros of a compost pile is it can be used for food scraps, yard trimmings, wood, and some manures. High temperatures eliminate seeds and pathogens. Maintenance costs are the lowest among the composting methods. The start of the project is cons of compost pile. The start of the project is labor intensive. You can only do the compost pile outdoors. This option would be best for someone with outdoor space available. Troubleshooting tips for compost piles. If your compost pile does not get hot, add more greens. If your compost pile has an ammonia odor, pile is too wet and you should add more browns. Pile is attracting pests. Food scraps should be buried and do not add meat, dairy, or oils to the compost pile. The next one we're going to talk about is trench composting. Digging a hole in the ground and burying compostable materials. The process. Dig a trench 12 inches deep for about 6 inches of compostable material. Put compostable material in trench, cover with dirt, repeat. Harvest. There is nothing to harvest, it is already in the ground. Tools needed for trench composting: ground to dig large space for compostable material, and a shovel. The pros of trench composting: no aerating or shifting, scraps are out of sight, and there's no potential odor to attract pests. The cons of trench composting: a hole must be dug and covered every time to dispose of kitchen scraps. Hard to dig when the ground is frozen. This option would be best for someone that doesn't want to commit to a compost pile, has a large amount of land available to dig holes, and doesn't mind digging holes often. The tools needed for your tumble compost. You need a tumbling composter, green materials, brown materials, and water. A compost tumbler is a sealed compost container that can be turned using a handle to mix the composting materials. The process is to start with a handful or a shovelful of compost depending on the size of your tumbler. Roughly chop scraps. Add compostable materials including meat, fish, and bread. Monitor for bad smells to alert of a possible imbalance in the materials. Turn container every day. Repeat until full. Turn daily without adding scraps. When it's time to harvest, harvest when compostable material is unrecognizable and the compost is fresh smelling, dark, and crumbly. Most tumblers have an easy to harvest opening at the bottom. Place container under the tumbler to catch compost. Use harvest in the yard, flower beds, garden, or potted plants to fertilize. The pros of tumbler composting is it creates compost quickly. It's a lot faster than the other methods. It's less manual labor. The sealed container keeps pests out, and you can compost meat, fish, and bread because it is sealed and it won't allow pests in. The cons of tumbler composting is it is the most expensive option. Compost materials are more likely to become waterlogged because evaporation is not possible in the sealed container, so you have to keep a watch for that. This option would be best for someone that may not want to maintain a large pile and has the money to invest into the project. So here's a quick summary for outdoor composting options. Compost piles are cost efficient but are labor intensive. Trench composting does not require constant attention, but a trench must be dug every time compost materials are added. A tumbler compost is an expensive option but does provide ease of use. Everyone can compost today. A composting plan can be developed by anyone, regardless of the size of their home. After our discussion, you should be able to identify the best composting method for yourself and get started gathering materials to start your own composting adventure.